Welcome to Chess Now. Today is August 12th, 2010. This is episode 70. I am your host today, George Grasser. Today I don't have anybody to play, so what we thought about doing was showing you a few games that I had played previously against other people. Last week, you'll remember our guest was Tony Norris. I played him a game, on July 23rd of this year, and we're playing a match right now, and I'm leading by 2 points in the match, and I hope to see him again soon. So I was white and he was black, and I started out with pawn to d4. And the reason why I want to show you this game is because Tony could have played it a little bit differently, and had he done so, there would have been a special move, a unique move in which I have never seen before. It's a move that when you see it, you'll be like, it has nothing to do with the position, and yet it wins the game. So that's what I want to show you today. So I played pawn to d4. Tony responded pawn to d5. I played knight to f3. Tony played knight to f6. I played pawn to e3. Tony played bishop to f5. The bishop to f5 move, in my opinion, creates a little bit of a weakness on the queen side. So whenever anybody has played bishop to f5 against me in this position, I've always changed plans. I might have wanted to play maybe pawn to c3 or possibly pawn to b3, but I think pawn to c4 is the strongest move, causes the most stress on the center. Black responded e6. I then played knight to c3. Now my opponent Tony came at me with what I feel is a very interesting move. He played knight to c6. Now when you're playing a queen's pawn game, and black has also put out his queen's pawn, the move knight to c6 no longer allows the flexibility on the queenside pawn structure. So it's very interesting. I guess I don't quite know what the word I'm looking for. It just makes it a little bit different, makes it a little bit more difficult for black to play, in my opinion. I decided to trade pawns. C takes d5. Tony responded e takes d5. Then I responded bishop to b5. Tony responded bishop to d6. And then I decided to begin a small attack with knight to e5. Tony responded with what I feel is the correct move, bishop to d7. And now I decided to get the bishop pair as an advantage. I played knight takes d7. Tony, of course, recaptured with his queen. Queen captures d7. Now I thought that white had an advantage here, and I decided to go for it immediately. I decided to try to win the game on the spot. So I tried what I thought was a brilliant move, which is not a brilliant move. I played pawn to e4. Tony captured, knight captures e4. I responded, knight captures e4. And of course, Tony took back, d takes e4. Now it would seem the move I had hoped would give me advantage, pawn to d5, I no longer felt that way. And I'm trying to remember why. I think it was possibly because of bishop to b4 check, followed by either castles or rook to d8. So my plan ruined. I decided to choose queen to a4. Now that rook to d8 is what Tony responded with, and now that I don't have any more problems with d1 being, the pawn being pinned to d1, I decided to go ahead and play, in this position, pawn to d5. So in this position, white played pawn to d5. I forgot to put the pawn back. So bishop to b4 check, king to f1, and now Tony made a mistake. He played pawn to a6. Had he played queen takes d5, I was simply going to then, in my opinion, at the time I was playing the game, simply just win a piece. It turns out that's not going to happen. Queen takes b4. Now I'll let you, folks at home, take a look at this position. Black to move and win. And it took me quite a while to find how black would win this game. But it's right there in front of us, and it's very interesting. So I'll give you a couple seconds to figure it out. In this position, white is a piece ahead. What can black do? Queen d1 check? Well, then my queen just goes back to e1. So that's not it. How about the simple rook to d7? Now all of a sudden everything is just cut off. White gets his head just chopped right off. The queen is attacked. The knight is no longer pinned. So what can white do? Move the queen away. Queen takes bishop. Move the queen over to a4. Then queen to d1, queen captures d1, rook captures d1, and the rook at h1 falls. So that's not going to work. Bishop captures knight. Seems to get rid of the problem easy enough, but it fails to queen to d3 check. King to e1, and queen d1 is mate. Same for king to g1. Queen, excuse me. Yes, queen to d1 leads to mate. So, unfortunately, Tony didn't see that. And he played pawn to a6, which leads me to just be a piece ahead, and I won't even bother showing you really the rest of the game. Bishop takes, pawn recaptured, and white is a piece ahead, and the game is basically over. So what I'll do now is show you a different game. In this game I was white, and I just played it last night, so it should still be fresh in my mind. It's a game that I lost, so this should be a little bit of an education for both of us. Played it at the Suffern Chess Club in Suffern, New York. And my opponent was Mr. Reyes, R-E-Y-E-S. I played pawn to d4. He responded pawn to d5. I played the quiet and conservative pawn to e3. Knight to f6. I responded bishop to d3. And now my opponent made an interesting move. He played bishop to g4. The flexibility that I have in my play is I can go from a quiet stonewall Kali system into something that is very attacking and dynamic. So I decided to play pawn to f3. And when he retreated, even though this position may call for a move like knight to e2, or maybe pawn to c4, I decided to just go at him right away with pawn to g4. Black responded with bishop to g6, and I pushed the g-pawn again to g5, trying to gain a space advantage on the king side. My opponent then played knight on f6 to d7. I decided to take as much control of the center as possible, and I played pawn to e4. My opponent responded with pawn to e6. I decided to keep more pressure, a little bit more pressure on the bishop at g6, and I played pawn to h4. Now my opponent played a very interesting move, which I thought was not good when he played it. But it turns out to be an irritation for me that I couldn't overcome. He played bishop to h5. That pins the pawn at f3. And it was right about now that I realized that maybe my opponent wasn't such a good player. So I decided, and I played a natural move, bishop to f4. So I underestimated my opponent, and it cost me, because now he played a very interesting move. After I played bishop to f4, he attacked me with pawn to e5, and that was a move that I didn't even consider. So that shows you how you can get into hot water real quickly if you don't look at all the moves your opponent can play. So I played d captures e5. Then my opponent played knight to c6, putting the pressure on the e5 pawn. So I didn't feel anything wrong in this position, and I just captured again. E takes d5, and I felt I was well on my way to score a victory. My opponent played knight on c, takes e5. And I had a couple of thoughts in this position. I felt maybe I could play queen to e2, bishop to e4, or the move I did choose, bishop takes e5. My opponent could respond with queen to e7 because the bishop is pinned, but he didn't. He played knight captures e5. And I thought all is well and good. And played bishop to b5 check. Pawn to c6, d takes c6. And for some reason, I didn't consider any of White's replies in any of too much detail. It looks like it might be possible. Knight takes f3 check, but maybe that doesn't work because b7 is hanging. But in any event, my opponent decided to play queen takes d1 check. king takes d1, and my opponent played rook to d8 with check. It's probably a little bit better if he just castles with the check. So I'm a pawn ahead, or will be a pawn ahead, and I don't sense the danger even yet. I played knight to d2. He played b takes c6. And then I retreated bishop to e2 to cover my f3 pawn. If I were to place it on a4, well then simply knight takes f3. And this rook has the knight at d2 pinned. The rook on d8 has the knight on d2 pinned. So I retreated bishop to e2. And then when my opponent played bishop to c5, I realized that even though I'm a pawn ahead, my position is not good. I don't have any major pieces beyond the second rank. My opponent has a lot more activity than I do. And despite him being rated, I would say maybe some 500 points less, he goes on to beat me. So I'll show you the finish up of the game. I played king to e1, but Black probably has already a decisive advantage. Black castled kingside. I played pawn to f4. I probably have other choices in this position. Probably knight to e4 could have been considered, or maybe even rook to d1. Just something to get my pieces out. I didn't do that this game at all. Pawn to f4. Knight to g4. I then played knight to e4. My opponent played bishop to e3. And now it's really hard for me to find a move. I probably should do rook to d1 in this position to try to alleviate some of the pressure Black is building up. So I played knight to h3, rook on f to e8, and I might as well resign. I decided to go for bishop to d3, bishop to g6, bishop takes e4 is threatened. If I move the knight away, that can't be good. I wonder why. Probably just simply because of bishop takes bishop, pawn takes bishop, and rook takes pawn. The bishop on e3 is going to take this f-pawn with discovered check. So I decided to push pawn to f5, hoping that this trick worked, and it simply just didn't work. Bishop takes f5, knight to f6 check, g takes f6, bishop takes f5, bishop to d2 check, king to f1, and knight to e3 check, king to f2, and white is a piece down after knight to f5. Now I'll show you a little bit of the game that inspired this type of play on my behalf. The man's name was Emil Joseph Diemer, D-I-E-M-E-R. And he played very, very aggressive chess.
You can continue reviewing the game, but I'm going to sit down for a second.
Okay, sure.
Where did you play this game that you're going to review?
That game that I just played, I played at the Suffern Chess Club in Suffern, New York. But what I wanted to do was show the folks what inspired me to play that game the way I did. Okay, this is a portion of the game. I'm not going to go through the whole game, of Emil Joseph Diemer versus Helling, H-E-L-I-N-G. You can check that out on chessgames.com. Emil Joseph Diemer played pawn to d4, Helling played knight to f6. Diemer played pawn to f3. Helling played pawn to d6. Now, this is very interesting, folks. Follow along. Pawn to e4. Pawn to g6. Pawn to g4. Bishop to g7. Pawn to g5. Knight on f to d7 because the knight was attacked. Diemer now plays pawn to f4. You see the theme that's going along here, folks? Pawn to c5. Pawn to d5. Helling responded, pawn to b5. Diemer again. Pawn to c3. Pawn to a6 for black. Diemer again. Pawn to h4. What's going on here, folks, huh? Knight to b6. Pawn to h5. Is this chess or what? e6. Pawn to h6. Bishop to f8. Pawn to a4. Black takes. D takes. E takes d5. Excuse me. E takes d5. Pawn to a5. Knight b6 to d7. E takes d5. Bishop to e7. Pawn to c4. Pawn to f6. C takes b5. F takes g5. And now finally, what we're witness here to today is 17 pawn moves in a row. That was Emil Diemer's next move, pawn to f5, and white has just played 17 pawn moves in a row.
So that's
amazing. Well, it's just amazing that 17 pawn moves in a row and they were all reasonable moves.
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing to criticize any single one of those pawn moves. It was quite amazing. So I'll go over a little bit of the game. I didn't record the entire score. f5, g takes f5, queen to h5, king to f8, knight to f3, rook to g8, pawn to b6, bishop to b7, knight to c3, knight to f6, and Diemer just tried to consolidate with knight takes pawn. Knight takes h5, capturing the white queen, but then Diemer came in. Knight to e6 with check, king to e8, and then after a few more moves, white won the game. So let's assess the position at this point. Knight takes d8. King takes d8. And it looks like, let me see now. Rook takes h5, of course. 3. And it would appear that black must have made a couple of more mistakes, because I don't really see anything fatal in his position that he would have lost this game. Material is even, right? 1, 2, 3. White is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Material is even. Well, anyway, you folks can look it up on chessgames.com.
We could probably play a live game here.
Alrighty.
I didn't quite get the technology stuff running, but maybe
Alright.
next time we'll get that working.
All right, we've got just a few minutes now.
Okay. Yeah, about 4 or 5 minutes.
All right.
It's impolite to make the first move until both players are ready, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll go to e4.
E4, E5.
Knight to f3.
Knight to C6.
Bishop to d2.
Bishop to E2.
e2.
Very conservative play. Okay, knight to F6.
Pawn to d3.
Protecting the E4. Pawn